In the fascinating world of ancient Rome, marriage looked very different from what we think of today. Back then, getting married wasn't really about love or spending your life with someone special. It was more like making a business deal or forming a powerful alliance between families. Surprisingly, it was totally normal, even expected, for Roman husbands to be unfaithful. Affairs weren't hidden or shameful like they might be today. In fact, many men had casual flings with women known as courtesans, or even long-term lovers outside of marriage. But that's not all. Roman men often had romantic or physical relationships with other men too, and this was seen as a regular part of life. To truly understand how the Romans thought about love and desire, we have to let go of today's ideas about relationships and think from their point of view, where marriage, power, and pleasure were all deeply connected. In ancient Rome, people didn't label themselves the way we often do today, as gay, straight, or bisexual. Instead, they cared more about who was in control during a relationship than who was involved. In a typical man-woman relationship, the man was seen as the dominant one, the giver, while the woman was the receiver. This wasn't just about the relationship itself. It was also about showing who had the power. When two men were involved, things got more complicated. One of them had to take on the receiver role, which Romans thought of as more feminine and submissive. That position often carried a social stigma for adult men, but not always, especially if the younger partner was still a teenager. One well-known type of same-sex relationship was called pederasty. In this setup, an older man, called the Erastes, formed a bond with a teenage boy known as the Eromenos. But it wasn't just about romance or intimacy. These relationships often included mentorship, guidance, and help with getting ahead in society. Back then, big age differences in these relationships weren't shocking like they would be today, especially among the wealthy and powerful. For the Roman elite, it was seen as a normal part of a young man's journey into adulthood, offering him important connections and a way into the world of politics and influence. Even among Rome's most powerful men, emperors, generals, and politicians, it was completely normal to have both male and female lovers. What's surprising is that this wasn't seen as cheating, at least not the way we think of it today. Back then, there were no birth control methods, and giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could go through. So when a man had affairs outside of marriage, especially with other men, it was sometimes seen as a way to avoid putting his wife at risk, a kind of ancient birth control in a strange and practical sense. In same-sex relationships, the person with more power, like an emperor, was usually expected to take the dominant masculine role. This showed off his strength and authority. But Roman society didn't always follow its own rules. Sometimes even the most powerful men didn't stick to these expectations. Believe it or not, Julius Caesar, one of the most famous leaders in Roman history, was said to enjoy being the more submissive partner in his same-sex relationships. This shocked many people at the time, and left Romans gossiping and confused, because it didn't match the image of a strong, commanding ruler. Emperor Hadrian was not like most Roman rulers. Although he was married to a woman mainly for political reasons, he seemed to have no real romantic interest in her. In fact, many historians believe they never even shared a physical relationship. This idea comes from the fact that both Hadrian and his wife had many lovers of their own, and Hadrian gave most of his attention to men. One young man in particular stood out, a beautiful and intelligent teenager named Antinous. Hadrian adored him. He made sure Antinous received an excellent education, and the two travelled together across the empire. But their close bond ended in tragedy. While they were in Egypt, Antinous mysteriously drowned in the Nile River. Heartbroken, Hadrian took extreme steps to honour him. He built an entire city near the place where Antinous died and named it after him. He even had Antinous' body mummified and brought back to Rome. Hadrian went as far as having coins made with Antinous' face and declared him a god. Incredibly rare, the worship of Antinous spread throughout the empire. Hadrian wasn't the only emperor with unusual love stories. Emperor Nero also had romantic relationships with men, but his behaviour shocked even the Romans. Most emperors chose their lovers from palace slaves and still treated them like servants. Nero, however, did something very different. He held full wedding ceremonies. In one case, he married a former slave named Pythagoras, but Nero played the role of the bride, wearing a veil and all, while Pythagoras was the groom. This confused the public because Nero, as emperor, was expected to take the dominant masculine role. Later, Nero married another young male slave named Sporus. This time, to please the Roman people, he took on the masculine role himself, showing how even emperors had to balance their personal desires with public expectations. However, some of Emperor Nero's actions would be deeply disturbing by today's standards. In one shocking case, to make sure the public saw him as the dominant masculine figure in his relationship with Sporus, Nero had the boy castrated, a cruel act done purely for image and control. There are other examples of Nero being harsh or abusive toward his lovers, but it's hard to know exactly what's true. The most shocking claim about Emperor Nero is the ancient assertion that he committed incest with his mother, Agrippina the Younger. This allegation appears primarily in the works of the historian Suetonius, the lives of the Caesars, and more cautiously in Tacitus's annals. Both suggest Agrippina initiated the relationship to maintain control over Nero after he became emperor. While the incest allegation is a notorious part of Nero's dark legend, it is almost universally regarded by credible historians as a vicious fabrication. It represents a powerful example of how political enemies in ancient Rome used sexual slander, the most shocking taboo, to destroy reputations posthumously. But while Nero's behaviour was extreme, another emperor, Tiberius, is remembered even more darkly, especially for how he treated young people around him. Tiberius is often described as one of the worst offenders when it came to abusing his power over his lovers. He had a strong interest in much younger boys, and the way he treated them has led many historians to call him one of the most sexually corrupt emperors in Roman history. Much of this happened far from the public eye. Tiberius spent many of his later years in luxury villas on islands in the Mediterranean, especially the island of Capri. He had boys brought there officially as servants, but many reports suggest they were also used to satisfy his desires. Some of the stories about Tiberius are likely exaggerated. Roman historians often added shocking details to make their subjects look worse. But even if only part of it is true, it paints a deeply disturbing picture of how absolute power could be abused in the Roman Empire. In ancient Greece, being beautiful and male could be a death sentence. Forget everything you think you know about concubines. Most people imagine veiled women in silk, waiting behind palace walls in places like China or the Middle East. But in the heart of Western civilization, ancient Greece, it wasn't just women who were taken as concubines. Young boys, some barely past childhood, were forced into roles meant to entertain, seduce, and obey. And what's more shocking, this practice was not only accepted by society, it was celebrated by some of its most famous thinkers. In many ancient cultures, elite members of society not only married wives, but also kept concubines on the side, serving a dual purpose. First, to boost a man's prestige through a demonstration of his ability to produce children, and second, to display his limitless access to pleasure. Records show that the tradition of taking concubines was spread across the world. Many prominent figures in ancient Greece had one, or sometimes even two, concubines seated close by, as though they were ornaments in a private collection. However, what makes this even more fascinating and disturbing is the fact that there was a huge number of male concubines in ancient Greece. Male concubines were not the exception. They were often the norm. But beneath the silken robes, beautiful faces, and the illusion of opulence, there lay a sinister truth. Behind the closed doors of marble villas and banquet halls, male concubines were subjected to lives riddled with exploitation, cruelty, and sometimes even death. They were stripped of autonomy, silenced by shame, and used as instruments of pleasure for men of power. In ancient Greece, relationships with concubines had little to do with love, affection, or mutual understanding. It was about power dynamics. The Greeks prized dominance and viewed the submissive role with disdain. Thus, for a man to keep concubines even while married was not shameful. As long as the man retained the dominant position in the relationship, society turned a blind eye. This is where the male concubine enters the picture, but not as an equal. These relationships were often between an older man and a much younger boy, frequently pre-adolescent or just entering puberty. The older male was the Erastes, the dominant and experienced mentor. The boy, referred to as a katamite or eromenos, was the submissive, the learner, and often, heartbreakingly, the victim. This entire structure formed the practice of pederasty, a widespread and controversial institution in ancient Greece. While some scholars of the time praised it as a form of intellectual and moral mentorship, others condemned it as outright exploitation masked by philosophy. At its core, pederasty was often transactional. The elder offered education, status, or gifts in exchange for access. In some city-states like Sparta, these arrangements were institutionalized and even celebrated. Boys were essentially handed over to older men to be guided, a term that too often blurred into manipulation and abuse. And yet, societal opinions varied. While such practices were embraced in certain places, other regions, like Athens, began pushing back. Laws were drafted to protect freeborn boys from overt exploitation. But even these laws had glaring loopholes. For instance, adult male-to-male penetration was banned in Athens to preserve dignity, yet penetration of boys remained widely tolerated. These legal technicalities allowed abuse to flourish under the veil of mentorship and cultural tradition. Catamites were more than companions. They were entertainers, often trained in music, dance, and poetry. They served wine at lavish symposia, recited verse, and were expected to please in more ways than one. Though they might be adorned in jewellery or fine clothing, they were, in essence, carefully groomed tools of gratification. Some were slaves. Others were sold into the role by desperate families hoping for social favour. Most had no choice. Worse still, some boys were castrated, intentionally mutilated to prevent them from growing facial hair or developing deeper voices. They were dressed in feminine clothing, perfumed and styled to resemble girls. This grotesque practice was neither isolated nor rare. The term puer deliciatus, meaning delicate boy, was used to describe slaves groomed exclusively for bodily satisfaction. Some were castrated not only to preserve their appearance, but also to mark them as permanent objects of submission. These acts were carried out not in secret, but often with society's silent approval or apathy. Such imagery is immortalized in artifacts like the infamous Warren Cup, a silver Roman drinking vessel that graphically portrays acts between older men and younger boys. To this day, it shocks modern viewers not just because of its explicit nature, but because it was designed as a luxury item, an object of pride. Freeborn boys, however, were given limited protections. They wore a toga praetexta, signalling their untouchable status. But this protection was only effective if the boy belonged to a family of influence. The average male concubine, a slave or foreigner, was entirely at the mercy of his dominus. The body of a slave had no civic identity. It was considered property, usable, disposable, expendable. The elite were largely immune to prosecution when it came to their treatment of those beneath them. Laws like the Lex Scantinia made it illegal to assault freeborn citizens, but did nothing to protect those already considered objects. For these boys, consent was irrelevant. Their voices were swallowed by marble walls and gilded cages. Interestingly, the idea of gender in ancient Greece was far more fluid than many assume. Men cross-dressed. Gods changed form. Gender roles were flexible in myth and ritual, even if rigidly enforced in real life. The Greeks did not view attraction through the strict categories we use today. In many cases, it was the role played in the relationship, dominant or submissive, that mattered more than biological sex. This fluidity is personified in the god Hermaphroditus, born of Hermes and Aphrodite. He was a figure of duality, depicted with the beauty of a woman and the body of a man. His story tells of transformation, a water nymph, madly in love with him, beg the gods to unite them forever. The result was a single androgynous form, a symbol of blended identities. From his name came the word hermaphrodite. Even Zeus, king of the gods, was said to have taken male lovers and sometimes disguised himself in female form. In myth, gender was pliable. In society, however, power dynamics remained rigid. Being the passive partner, especially for a man, carried deep stigma. That is why male concubines, despite their prevalence, were often shrouded in shame. They were needed but never honoured. When Rome absorbed Greece, many of these practices continued under different names. Emperors took male lovers openly. Emperor Elagabalus even married a male athlete named Zoticus in a public ceremony. His flamboyance scandalized even the decadent Roman elite. Yet such relationships persisted well into the early Roman Empire. Everything changed with the rise of Christianity. As monotheism took root, the old gods were swept aside. Jupiter, Mars, and Aphrodite were replaced by a single omnipotent god, and with him came a new moral order. The Codex Theodosianus, created in the 4th century AD, explicitly banned same-sex unions and labelled them contrary to nature. Emperor Justinian III went further, criminalising male intimacy as a capital offence. Under this new regime, the concept of the male concubine was not only obsolete, it was heresy. The practice was buried along with the temples and statues of the old gods. What had once been celebrated was now condemned. The very boys who once adorned banquet halls in silk were now held up as symbols of moral decay. In many ways, this was the only grim silver lining of the new era, the end of formalized exploitation of male bodies. But even this came at a cost. One form of repression replaced another. Love was not liberated, it was regulated, confined to rigid norms, and anything outside them was cast into darkness. While history books focus on female concubines in ancient China, they rarely mention that male concubines were equally common, and their stories were often far more tragic. These weren't servants or entertainers, but young men forced into intimate relationships with powerful older men who collected them like art pieces. For over 2,000 years across multiple Chinese dynasties, this practice remained hidden in plain sight. Families sold their sons to survive famines, while talent scouts roamed villages searching for the perfect combination of beauty and intelligence. These boys, some as young as 8, were transformed into living possessions whose only purpose was to please their owners. Their stories reveal a dark side of Chinese imperial culture that most people never knew existed, where human dignity meant nothing compared to wealth and power. In ancient China, male concubines were called nanchong, male favourites, or tongling, referring to beautiful young men. Unlike servants who worked in households or eunuchs who served in palaces, these young men occupied a specific and disturbing role in Chinese society. They were purchased, owned, and kept primarily for companionship and intimate relationships with their masters. This practice flourished during the Han dynasty, reached its peak during the Tang dynasty, and continued through the Song and Ming dynasties. Historical records from the Book of Han and various court documents reveal that male concubines were as accepted as their female counterparts in wealthy households across China. The buyers weren't just emperors and nobles. Wealthy merchants, high-ranking officials, and even some Buddhist monks kept male concubines. The practice was so normalized that families openly advertised their sons' availability, and professional matchmakers specialized in the trade. Unlike female concubines, who might eventually marry or bear children, male concubines had no such escape routes. These young men were expected to master poetry, calligraphy, music, and conversation. They often received better education than most female concubines, because their owners valued intellectual companionship alongside physical beauty. Many could recite classical literature, play multiple instruments, and engage in philosophical discussions. This education, however, served only to make them more valuable property. The geographic spread was vast. While Beijing and other imperial cities had the highest concentrations, The practice extended to wealthy households in provinces like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Guangdong. Port cities with prosperous merchant classes such as Guangzhou developed thriving markets for male concubines. What made this system particularly cruel was its social acceptance. Confucian scholars who preached moral virtue kept male concubines without shame. Buddhist temples that claimed spiritual purity secretly housed them. The hypocrisy was staggering, yet everyone pretended it was normal. The age ranges varied, but most male concubines were acquired between 8 and 16 years old. By their mid-20s, they were considered past their prime. Unlike female concubines, who might gain status through childbearing, male concubines faced inevitable abandonment as they aged. This created a constant cycle of fear and desperation that defined their entire existence in ways that female concubines, despite their own suffering, rarely experienced. The transformation of innocent boys into male concubines began with desperate families facing starvation. During famines, floods, or economic collapse, parents faced an impossible choice: watch their children die or sell them to wealthy households. Sons were often chosen over daughters because male concubines commanded higher prices than female servants. Professional talent scouts, known as renya, human teeth, travelled through impoverished villages searching for boys with specific qualities. They looked for clear skin, delicate features, bright eyes, and graceful movements. Intelligence mattered as much as beauty, because wealthy buyers wanted companions who could hold conversations about literature, politics, and philosophy. The selection process was methodical and degrading. Boys were examined like livestock, their teeth checked for health, their hands inspected for artistic potential, and their voices tested for singing ability. Scouts paid particular attention to bone structure, believing they could predict how a child would look as a teenager. Those who passed the initial inspection were taken from their families immediately. Zhang Dai, a Ming Dynasty writer, documented this process in his memoirs, describing how scouts would arrive in villages during harvest failures. They carried silver coins and contracts written in language illiterate farmers couldn't understand. Parents who signed these documents rarely saw their sons again. The contracts typically lasted 10 to 15 years, though many boys died long before their terms ended. Once purchased, boys entered a brutal training period designed to erase their previous identities. They were given new names, often poetic ones like Precious Jade or Autumn Moon. Their heads were shaved, and they were dressed in silk robes that marked them as property rather than people. Resistance was met with beatings, starvation, or worse punishments. The training curriculum was surprisingly sophisticated. Boys learned classical Chinese poetry, memorized thousands of verses, and practiced calligraphy for hours daily. They studied music, learning to play instruments like the guqin and pipa. Dancing, singing, and theatrical performance were mandatory skills. Some received training in massage, herbal medicine, and even basic accounting to make them more valuable to their future owners. Psychological conditioning was equally important. Trainers used a combination of rewards and punishments to break down a boy's sense of self-worth. They were taught that their only value lay in pleasing their masters. Any expression of homesickness, rebellion, or independent thought was quickly crushed. The goal was to create beautiful, talented, and completely submissive young men. The mortality rate during training was horrifyingly high. Boys who couldn't adapt to the schedule, harsh punishments, or psychological pressure often died from exhaustion or malnutrition. Historical records from the Tang dynasty suggest that only about 60% of purchased boys survived to become actual concubines. The rest were buried in unmarked graves, their families never knowing their fate. The daily existence of male concubines was a carefully choreographed performance of submission and entertainment. They woke before dawn to prepare themselves for their master's day, spending hours on grooming, makeup, and selecting appropriate clothing. Unlike servants who had specific tasks, Male concubines lived in constant readiness to satisfy their owners' whims. Their living quarters reflected their ambiguous status within households, better than servants, but inferior to wives. They occupied beautifully decorated rooms that were essentially luxurious prisons. Windows were often barred, doors locked from the outside, and movements monitored by trusted servants. Silk robes, jade ornaments, and fine furniture couldn't disguise the fact that they were captives. Competition among male concubines in the same household was fierce and sometimes deadly. Masters enjoyed pitting them against each other, promising rewards for the most entertaining performance or threatening punishment for whoever displeased them. This created an atmosphere of paranoia where friendships were dangerous and trust was nearly impossible. The hierarchies were complex and brutally enforced. Older concubines who had survived years in the household wielded power over newcomers, often becoming cruel taskmasters themselves. They had learned that cooperation meant weakness, and weakness meant elimination. New arrivals faced hazing that included food deprivation, public humiliation, and sometimes physical violence sanctioned by the household's established order. Daily schedules varied depending on a master's preferences and social calendar. Mornings might involve poetry recitation, calligraphy practice, or musical rehearsals. Afternoons could bring massage duties, private conversation sessions, or public appearances at social gatherings, where they performed like trained animals for guests. The psychological toll was devastating. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety, depression, and trauma responses. They learned to read their master's moods instantly, adjusting their behavior to avoid punishment. Some became expert manipulators, using their intelligence and training to gain small advantages or temporary protection. Meals were another form of control. Food quality and quantity depended entirely on the master's satisfaction. Favourites received delicacies and wine, while those who had fallen from grace might survive on plain rice and vegetables. Weight management was crucial, since appearance directly affected their value and treatment. Relationships with female concubines and wives were complicated. Sometimes they formed alliances against cruel masters, sharing information and offering emotional support. More often, they were competitors for resources and attention. Female concubines sometimes resented male concubines for receiving better education and more personal attention from the shared master. Medical care was minimal and often dangerous. Illness meant temporary uselessness, and masters had little patience for sick concubines. Traditional medicine offered limited treatment, and many common ailments became fatal without proper care. Injuries from beatings or accidents were treated secretly to avoid appearing like damaged goods. The rare moments of genuine human connection occurred between concubines who had survived together for years. These bonds formed in desperation and were maintained in secret. Sometimes they provided the only emotional sustenance in lives otherwise devoid of authentic affection. They developed private communication methods, shared scarce resources, and sometimes even planned escape attempts together. Such plans rarely succeeded, but the hope itself mattered. The imperial court represented the pinnacle of male concubine culture, where young men could achieve tremendous power, or face spectacular destruction. Emperor Ai of the Han dynasty created the most famous male concubine story in Chinese history through his relationship with Dongxian, a bond so intense it inspired the phrase cut sleeve, which became synonymous with male love throughout Chinese literature. Dongxian entered the imperial court at age 17 as the son of a minor official. His extraordinary beauty caught the emperor's attention during a court ceremony. Records in the Book of Han describe him as having skin like white jade and eyes that sparkled like stars. Within weeks, he rose from obscurity to become the emperor's most trusted companion and beloved favourite. The emperor showered him with titles, estates and treasures worth a fortune. The famous cut sleeve story occurred when Emperor Ai awoke from a nap to find Dongxian sleeping on his robe sleeve. Rather than wake him, the emperor cut off his sleeve, showing that affection outweighed even imperial dignity. The tale became legendary as the ultimate symbol of devotion. Emperor Ai granted Dongxian unprecedented political power, making him a high-ranking official despite his youth and inexperience. Dongxian's family members received government positions, and his influence grew so strong that officials began approaching him rather than the emperor directly. But the moment Emperor Ai died at age 26, Dongxian's world collapsed. The next ruler, pressured by court officials who resented Dongxian's influence, stripped him of his titles and ordered his execution. Facing torture and public humiliation, Dongxian chose suicide, ending one of history's most documented same-gender imperial relationships. His story became a cautionary tale. Male favourites could rise higher than anyone, but they could also fall faster than anyone. Emperor Zhengdi of the Ming dynasty took male favouritism to a different extreme. Instead of one devoted companion, he collected dozens of young men from across the empire and housed them in a special palace section called the Leopard Quarter. These weren't just companions, but constant attendants for hunting trips, military outings, and elaborate parties that scandalized the court. Zhengde's favourites wielded significant political influence, sometimes shaping military appointments, tax decisions, and diplomatic relations. The emperor trusted them more than trained advisors, fueling corruption and administrative chaos. Records suggest that conflicts were even encouraged because favourites framed military campaigns as exciting adventures rather than serious state matters. The Qing dynasty tried to suppress these practices with strict moral codes and harsh punishments for officials caught keeping male concubines. Yet even then, emperors kept male favourites in secret, more discreet than their predecessors. Imperial concubines faced dangers unknown to those in private households. Palace intrigue meant rival factions targeted favourites for assassination, poisoning, or false accusations of treason. The higher their status, the more enemies they gained. Unlike wealthy merchants who might develop genuine attachment, emperors often treated favourites as sophisticated toys, discarded when something newer appeared. The palace's vast resources meant a constant stream of beautiful young men arrived as tribute from provincial officials seeking favour. The political implications were staggering. Favourites influenced everything from tax collection to military strategy, often with disastrous consequences. The Tang dynasty's decline has sometimes been linked to rulers distracted by obsessions, male and female favourites alike, while governance rotted beneath them. Many imperial male concubines died violently. Palace records mention suicide, murder by rivals, execution for imagined crimes, and death from the physical and psychological strain of court life. Their bodies were often buried in unmarked graves. Their names were erased, as if they had never existed. Chinese society created a bizarre double standard around male concubines that revealed the gap between public morality and private behaviour. Confucian teachings emphasized virtue, family honour, and proper relationships, yet many scholars who preached these values kept male concubines in private with no sense of contradiction. Regional differences were stark. In northern China, especially around Beijing, the practice was more openly acknowledged among the wealthy. Southern regions like Guangdong and Fujian were more conservative in public, but equally active in private. Merchants in port cities maintained networks to acquire and trade male concubines, while publicly supporting traditional values. Literature and poetry helped romanticize these relationships. Famous poets wrote verses praising male beauty and companionship, often avoiding explicit details, but still helping normalize male concubinage culturally, even when society pretended to condemn it. Economic desperation fueled the system. Families who sold their sons used the money to survive or to arrange marriages for daughters, treating it as a necessary sacrifice. It created a cruel arithmetic. One child's suffering could keep the rest alive. Buddhist and Taoist temples added another layer of contradiction. While preaching detachment from worldly desire, some monasteries secretly housed male favourites for wealthy patrons who donated generously. Some monks kept personal favourites and justified it through convoluted arguments about mentorship and spiritual purification. Class divisions were absolute. Poor families sold their sons to survive. Wealthy families would never consider such arrangements for their own children. The rich fed on the desperation of the poor, turning poverty into a renewable supply for entertainment and pleasure. Scholars built elaborate justifications. Some argued that male concubines offered intellectual companionship unavailable from wives who were typically denied education. Others claimed these relationships were purer than marriage because they avoided inheritance problems. Some even suggested that avoiding wives prevented pregnancies that could complicate succession. Government responses were equally hypocritical. Laws existed, but enforcement was selective and corrupt, used to punish political enemies rather than protect victims. Officials who publicly supported moral reform often maintained their own hidden collections. The physical and psychological destruction of male concubines was systematic and often irreversible. Unlike female concubines who might gain limited autonomy through motherhood or widowhood, male concubines faced a steady decline that began the moment they entered a household and continued until death. Aging was especially cruel. Their entire value depended on youth. By their early 20s, many showed signs of premature aging from stress, poor nutrition, and constant pressure to maintain perfection. They spent hours applying cosmetics, styling hair, and enduring painful beauty treatments that damaged skin and health. Substance abuse became a common escape. Opium, readily available in elite households, offered temporary relief from trauma. Many became addicted quickly, spiraling into dependency that made them even easier to control. Suicide was tragically common. Exact numbers are hard to confirm because deaths were often covered up or blamed on illness. Ming-era records describe young men throwing themselves from rooftops, drowning in household ponds, or hanging themselves in locked rooms, then being reported as accidents to avoid scandal. Physical abuse was normalized. Even kind masters beat concubines occasionally. Cruel ones inflicted daily violence over minor mistakes, or simply for entertainment. Their isolation meant screams went unheard, or were ignored by servants terrified of punishment. Medical care was primitive and risky. Physical injuries were treated with remedies that sometimes caused more harm than healing. Broken bones were set poorly, leaving permanent damage. Psychological suffering was not treated at all. It was expected. Some male concubines formed survival networks, sharing warnings about violent masters, escape opportunities, and tactics for enduring. A few rare individuals transitioned into legitimate roles as artists, scholars, or merchants after being abandoned or after a master died. But these cases required extraordinary talent, luck, and access to resources most never had. Successful escapes became legends, offering hope while also proving how nearly impossible freedom really was. The practice began declining in the late Qing period as modernization and Western influence challenged older social structures. Christian missionaries wrote about what they saw, generating international pressure for reform. The 1911 Republican Revolution officially ended imperial rule, and the new government outlawed concubinage, male and female, seeking to modernize and gain global respect. Enforcement was inconsistent, and the practice persisted in some areas for years. What happened to the last generation of male concubines is largely undocumented. Many were abandoned by masters afraid of legal consequences. Some died of starvation or illness, having never been taught how to live independently. Others vanished into the population, carrying their stories into silence. After 1949, new campaigns targeted feudal practices. Some former concubines were interrogated and forced to name former owners. Some were punished as symbols of the old system. Others were sent to labour camps. Modern China has largely erased this history from public memory. The topic remains sensitive because it complicates official narratives. Researchers face obstacles, and many documents have been destroyed or hidden. The stories of male concubines in ancient China reveal universal truths about exploitation. They show how societies can normalize horrific practices when they serve the powerful, while maintaining moral facades that hide the truth. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar patterns today. Trafficking, forced labor, and servitude still exist, often hidden behind laws or customs that protect the people who benefit. These young men, whose names are mostly lost, deserve to be remembered not as symbols, but as human beings who suffered and died in a system that treated them as property. Their stories remind us that progress is not guaranteed, and cruelty can return whenever people choose to look away. Most importantly, their experiences teach us that human dignity is not negotiable, no matter the culture and no matter the era. You might have watched Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and other imperial films where emperors and kings keep female concubines. But did you know that, in parts of African history, young males were also chosen as concubines for wealthy and powerful kings, sometimes living lives of luxury and privilege? To start with, most of us might have heard in history class that one of the oldest and most pervasive illusions about Africa is the idea that gender diversity and same-gender relationships were either non-existent or incidental. Despite their presence in some African Islamic royal settings, concubines, especially male concubines, remain an understudied subject in African history. Although it may sound like something from a bizarre fiction book, this did occur in African history, and you won't believe how common it was in certain places and periods. Concubinage is a system in which powerful men, such as kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants, maintain women or men as intimate companions. These powerful men sometimes displayed their male concubines at ceremonies and public occasions, showcasing their attractiveness and desirability. As a result, people who kept concubines were often seen as wealthy and influential. African empires is a term used in African studies to describe a number of pre-colonial African kingdoms with multi-ethnic systems that, typically through conquest, merged numerous populations and polities into a single entity. During this era, some African rulers kept male concubines frequently, just as they kept female concubines as well. While we've mentioned that male concubines were popular in certain courts, they were also a distinctive aspect of various African dynasties. They lived lifestyles that many people had never imagined. But none of this erases the fact that they existed, and many rulers preferred their company. Male concubines and their roles. Male concubines are often associated with ancient Greece or Rome, but, as mentioned above, some African empires also maintained similar practices. The question is, did these concubines live lives of glamour, riches, privileges, and rivalry, like the ones we see in imperial films, or was it complete misery? Prominent African leaders kept male concubines for various reasons. Sometimes it was to form alliances or demonstrate subordination. The reasons were many, but most of the time concubines were utilized as political tools and even presented to other monarchs as gifts or tribute. It has been centuries since this controversial practice began, and it appeared in several African regimes over time. Male concubines played a vital role in court life, which meant they occupied a complex position and at times held prestige inside royal courts. They occasionally received privileges and wealth that most people could only dream of, and as a result they were pampered with fine clothing, jewellery, and luxurious living quarters. One of the most important roles a male concubine was expected to play in a ruler's life was to provide pleasure and companionship. Male concubines were often valued and adored for their beauty, wit, and loyalty. Some even attained positions of authority and influence within the court, serving as advisors or managing specific facets of the kingdom's administration. They were also expected to be well versed in the arts, music, poetry, and dance, to entertain the ruler and guests with their talents. However, their status was never equal to that of the ruler, or even other high-ranking officials. Despite often living luxurious lives, they were frequently subject to the whims of their monarch. They were sometimes seen as having a lower social position than free men, and were left with no choice but to abide by strict protocols, procedures, and norms. They were required to follow a strict code of conduct and always be submissive and respectful. For instance, male concubines typically woke up early in the morning, before the ruler or other court members. They would begin their grooming routine by bathing, removing unwanted hair, and exfoliating their skin to ensure they were always presentable for their masters. After grooming, they dressed in their finest clothes and made their way to the dining hall. There they prepared breakfast for the ruler and made sure their master was well taken care of. But their duties did not end there. In the afternoon, male concubines might attend meetings with their masters and other court members, providing advice and input on various matters, such as trade negotiations or military campaigns, things that wives and female concubines often could not participate in. When evening came, male concubines would prepare their master's meal, help dress him for dinner, and then provide entertainment. After dinner, they might retire to their quarters or socialize with other court members. As the night deepened, a male concubine might be summoned by his master for companionship or other matters the master deemed necessary. It is important to note that the experiences of male concubines in African empires varied widely, depending on their status and the attitudes of their masters. Some masters abused and mistreated male concubines, forcing them to perform acts against their will. In such cases, concubines had no control over their own lives. They were not allowed to form attachments to anyone else, only the master. Historical example. The kingdom of Dahomey was one example of a state that made extensive use of male concubines. This kingdom existed from the 17th to the 19th century in what is now modern-day Benin. The ruler of Dahomey was the king, and under his rule male concubines were known by specific local titles. Like other male concubines, their role included companionship, with their primary role often centered on serving the king. The selection and grooming process in African dynasties. The selection and grooming of male concubines was a fascinating and often enigmatic process. It depended on the specific empire and ruler, but there were common themes. Usually male concubines were selected from the ruler's own court or from neighbouring kingdoms. Most of the time, they were chosen for their physical beauty, intelligence, and talent. In some instances, rulers personally selected the concubines they favoured. Other times, the selection was left to trusted advisors or eunuchs. Once selected, male concubines were groomed, trained and educated in various skills and proper court etiquette. As a result, they were granted access to administrative aspects of court life, and sometimes received fine education. And you won't believe the strict and over-the-top rules they had to follow. After being selected to serve their masters, they were dressed in the finest clothes, ornamented with jewellery, and sometimes underwent cosmetic procedures. Imagine what kind of cosmetic procedures might have been done to men in ancient times. In some places, teeth were filed and bodies tattooed to meet local beauty standards. They were expected to maintain a certain level of physical fitness and appearance, and were often subject to dietary and hygiene rules. Like the geishas of Japan, as a comparison people often recognise, male concubines were trained to become skilled entertainers for rulers and guests. It might be safe to say they were expected to perform whatever entertainment pleased their master and impressed visitors. Being a male concubine was, in many cases, a demanding way of life. Entertainment was vital to their role. If the ruler favoured a particular concubine, he might be housed in special quarters within the palace or other elite residences. Perks and privileges. Surprisingly, male concubines were sometimes provided with servants of their own. Their quarters were adorned with luxurious furnishings and ornaments that reflected the high status of both the concubines and their masters. Kings often showered them with gemstones, pearls, and beautiful fabrics as signs of favour. But in exchange for this lavish treatment, a male concubine had to be ready at all times to satisfy his master. For many, It was the price they had to pay for the life they were forced or permitted to live. They might also be exempted from paying taxes and other duties imposed on the general population. They sometimes received special treatment in food, housing, and medical care, and some were allowed to travel, experiencing new cultures and environments. Another advantage was the protection and patronage of their masters, the impact on society. The practice of male concubinage had a significant impact on certain African empires, societies, and cultures, especially ideas about gender roles and relationships. The presence of male concubines challenged traditional assumptions about masculinity, femininity, and strictly monogamous relationships. It permitted forms of gender and social experimentation that could feel both liberating and frightening. As a result, social hierarchy became more fluid, sometimes clashing with conventional notions of position and authority. Still, the life of a male concubine was not easy. While there were kings who treated their male concubines with respect, others did the complete opposite. Sadly, concubines who fell out of favour with the king could be punished severely. While the life of male concubines in ancient Africa is not as simple as it seems, it is undeniable that they left a mark on society. At the very least, they opened possibilities for people to see that gender expression and roles could be more fluid than the strict rules societies often claim. When you picture Imperial Japan, a few key figures probably come to mind. There's the emperor, of course, a figure later forged into the image of a living god, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. We see the powerful shogun, the military dictators who really ran the country for centuries. We see the cunning regents of the Fujiwara clan who mastered the art of political marriage, turning the imperial bloodline into a tool for their own ambition. We see the stoic samurai, and the court ladies hidden behind screens whose lives of poetry and romance gave the world its very first novel. These are the characters we know, the names that fill our history books. But history isn't just about the names we remember. It's also shaped by the shadows, by the people who moved through the most sacred halls of power, but were destined to be forgotten. In the silent spaces between the official records, in a subtle detail of a court painting, lies another story. It's the story of men who belonged to a class all their own. They weren't monks or warriors or titled ministers. They were phantoms in the heart of the empire, whispers in the ear of the divine. They were the emperor's companions, his attendants, his confidants, and maybe much more. Their closeness to the throne gave them a life of incredible luxury and a front-row seat to the secrets of the state. But that closeness was also a razor's edge. With no official title, no land and no army, their survival depended on a currency far more volatile than gold, the personal favour of the most powerful and isolated man in the land. They held no swords, commanded no armies, and you won't find their names in the grand chronicles of Imperial Japan. Yet these forgotten men of the inner court were showered with unimaginable riches and trusted with the empire's most intimate secrets. They were the emperor's shadows, his companions in a gilded cage. This is the story of how they navigated a life of luxury, service, and survival, and why their history was almost completely erased. To understand the world these men lived in, you have to step inside the suffocating elegance of the Heian court. From 794 to 1185, the city of Heian-kyo, which we now call Kyoto, was the centre of the Japanese universe. It was a city built for beauty, not for war. Here, life wasn't measured in battles won, but in the perfection of a line of calligraphy, the subtle blend of incense, or the heart-wrenching composition of a 31-syllable poem. For the Kyuj, the high-ranking court nobles, life was an endless series of rituals, festivals, and aesthetic duties. 2/3 of the year was spent on elaborate Shinto or Buddhist ceremonies, and the rest was dedicated to the pursuit of miyabi, or courtly elegance. At the absolute centre of this world, and yet strangely removed from it, sat the emperor. In theory, His authority was absolute. He was the chief priest of Shinto and the source of all rank and titles. No man could call himself shogun without the emperor's blessing. But for much of Japanese history, especially during the Heian period, this divine power was more symbolic than real. The emperor was often a child placed on the throne by powerful clans, expected to step down while still young. He was the still, silent eye of the hurricane, a being so sacred he was almost paralyzed by his own divinity. Unlike kings in other countries, the Japanese emperor wasn't leading armies. He was expected to focus on poetry, art, and ritual. His life was intensely regimented, surrounded not by generals, but by women, his mother, wives, and ladies in waiting, and by a handful of male attendants who served inside the inner palace. This created a very unique power dynamic. Real power was held by the Fujiwara regents, who married their daughters to emperors to control the imperial line. Later, it would be the great warrior clans who plunged the nation into the Genpei War and gave rise to the first shogunate. But inside the palace walls, a different kind of power existed. The power of closeness, of influence, of intimacy. To be near the emperor, to have his ear, was a source of immense prestige. It was a world where appearances mattered more than reality, and winning favour was a full-time job. In this rarefied air, a world away from the grit and steel of the rising samurai, a specific type of man could thrive. He wasn't a bureaucrat or a warrior. He was a product of the court itself, bred for its unique environment. His skills weren't in fighting or governing, but in the delicate arts of companionship. He had to be a master of poetry and music, an expert in etiquette, and a witty conversationalist. In short, he was a living work of art designed to entertain, soothe, and serve the most isolated person in the empire. This was a gilded cage, a world of breathtaking beauty and suffocating rules, a place of immense privilege built on a foundation of total powerlessness. For the men who entered this inner world, without a title, every day was a performance. Their wealth, their safety, their very existence depended on pleasing their divine master and navigating the treacherous currents of a court defined by jealousy and ambition. They were adored, but they were also disposable. So how did a young man end up here? And what was the price of survival? The journey to the emperor's side didn't start with a heroic deed or a brilliant political move. It started in the cradle, in the elite homes of the Kyuge, the court nobility. In high society, rank was everything. A rigid hierarchy that decided what colour robes you wore and how high your gatepost could be. You were born into your station, and you didn't move. For the sons of these families, the path was laid out. Their sisters were valuable political pawns, married off to cement alliances. The sons had their own role. The ultimate prize was a top job in government, but those positions were few and fiercely contested. An alternative and in some ways more intimate path was direct service to the emperor. The education of these young men was designed for this world. They weren't taught practical governance. They were taught aesthetics. They had to master calligraphy because a man's character was judged by his handwriting. They had to be able to compose a tanka poem at a moment's notice. Since poems were how you communicated about love, friendship, and even politics, they studied Chinese classics, learned to play instruments like the flute or the koto, and became experts in courtly dances and games. It was all about demonstrating refinement. From this pool of cultured young men, some would be chosen for service in the inner palace. These were often the younger sons of noble families, the ones not in line to inherit the main titles. They were picked based on family rank, artistic skill, looks, and personality. A handsome face and a quick wit were huge assets. They might start as pages, but their real job was to become part of the emperor's immediate environment. You couldn't apply for this role. You were chosen, often on the recommendation of a powerful relative. For a family, having a son in this position was a huge honour. It gave them a direct line of potential influence that bypassed official government. But it also put the young man in a deeply vulnerable position. a beautiful ornament in a world where tastes could change in an instant. Once inside the palace, the duties of these men were as fluid as they were demanding. They weren't just servants. They were companions tasked with filling the long, lonely hours of a monarch who was more symbol than ruler. Their currency wasn't strength. It was their ability to engage, entertain, and connect with the emperor on a personal level. Their days revolved around the emperor's routine. They helped him with his elaborate layered robes, chatted with him during meals, and joined him in games like Go or Kimari, the graceful sport of keeping a deerskin ball in the air. They were his intellectual sparring partners, expected to discuss philosophy or collaborate on a poem. But the companionship likely went deeper. To understand that, we have to look at a widespread custom among Japan's elite at the time, Shudo, the way of the youth. This tradition, especially common among samurai and monks, described a relationship between an older man and an adolescent boy, wakashu. It could be a complex mix of mentorship, patronage, and often erotic love. It wasn't stigmatized the way it might be today. It was often framed as a noble bond. The older man guided the youth's career, and in return the youth offered loyalty, companionship, and affection. Once the boy reached adulthood, he would graduate and often marry a woman. The key was the age and status dynamic, not the gender. While direct, explicit proof from inside the emperor's private chambers is rare, it's hard to imagine the court being immune to a practice so common elsewhere. These relationships could have been purely platonic friendships, but they also could have followed the patterns of Shudo, with the emperor as the ultimate mentor and young companions chosen for youth and beauty as wakashu. In this light, their role takes on a deeper meaning. They offered an emotional outlet in a world where even the emperor's interactions with wives could be heavily ritualized. Unlike a female concubine, whose main value was producing an heir, a male companion's value was entirely personal, based on charm, wit, and the affection he could inspire. That made the position powerful in its own way. A favourite could wield immense soft power, influencing the emperor's mood and decisions through an intimate bond. It's also important to note, this was completely different from court eunuchs in China or the Ottoman Empire. Japan never developed a tradition of castration. These men weren't physically altered to be safe. Their powerlessness was built into the system itself. They had no official title to pass on and no dynasty to build. Their only real asset was the emperor's personal affection, a currency as valuable as it was terrifyingly unstable. Life as a favourite was like walking a tightrope. The silks were fine, but the currents of intrigue in the Heisen court were deadly. While these men might have the emperor's trust, they were completely exposed. They lacked the three things that gave others security: official rank, powerful family backing, and a clear path to a legacy. The main danger came from the same powerful clans that put emperors on the throne. The Fujiwara family, the puppet masters of the court, saw anyone who grew too close to the emperor as a threat. A male companion who became too beloved could become the target of vicious rumours, political isolation, or quiet removal. He was a rogue element in a carefully controlled system, and unlike a female consort, who bore the emperor a child, these men had no recognised role that could lock in power. Their status was based entirely on the shifting affections of one man. That made them easy to sacrifice. A rival faction might discredit him to weaken the emperor. With no official title, he had no formal way to defend himself. He could be dismissed on a whim, his fall from grace as swift as his rise. Then there was internal competition. The emperor could have several such companions, and jealousy between them could be fierce. They competed for time and attention, using artistic skill as weapons in a silent war of influence. A perfectly composed poem could be a victory. A clumsy word could be a disaster. Their entire existence was an anomaly in a society obsessed with rank and lineage. They were insiders with the access of nobles, but the security of servants. To survive, a companion needed more than a handsome face or talent for music. He needed emotional intelligence, political cunning, and the ability to read subtle signals of the court. It was a constant, exhausting performance where one misstep could end everything. For centuries, the imperial court remained the centre of Japanese high culture. But outside its perfumed halls, the samurai were rising. The Genpei War at the end of the 12th century marked a massive shift. When Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate in 1185, the emperor's political power was almost completely snuffed out. The court in Kyoto continued its rituals, but real power belonged to the shogun. The emperor's world became an even more isolated bubble. The role of the male companion likely continued, but in a court that was now a shadow of its former self. The true end for these forgotten men came much later, with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. This was a revolution. Power was officially restored to the emperor, but it was wielded by leaders determined to turn Japan into a modern state that could stand with the West. To do this, they believed Japan had to adopt not only Western technology, but Western social values. Suddenly, Japan looked at itself through a Victorian lens. Traditional practices that had been normal for centuries were now judged as backward or shameful. The complex traditions of male-male love, including Shudo, were no longer framed as noble mentorship. They were condemned under imported moral expectations. Even polygamy, standard for the nobility for many centuries, was ended. The imperial household law of 1889 formalized monogamy for the emperor. The emperor himself was repackaged, from a remote artistic figure into a masculine Western-style monarch, often shown in military uniform. The old court, with its esoteric rituals, was swept aside. In this new modern Japan, there was no place for the emperor's male companion. The role became an antique, a relic from a past that was being actively rewritten. And the secrecy that had always surrounded these men made them easy to forget. Their existence was inconvenient, a chapter of imperial history the builders of modern Japan were happy to close. Their history wasn't erased by a single command. It simply faded through cultural change and historical neglect. There are a few key reasons why. First, their position was fundamentally unofficial. History is written from records, and these men were designed to exist outside of them. They held no titles. They appear fleetingly in diaries or poems, often as unnamed figures. With no official footprint, they left little for historians to follow. Second, the Meiji Restoration was catastrophic for their memory. The new regime was on a national rebranding mission, and the intimate traditions of the old court were a deep embarrassment. The story Japan wanted to project was one of samurai valor and modern nationhood, not aesthetic court companions. As Western norms took hold, practices like Shudo became taboo and the men associated with them disappeared into silence. Finally, we tend to focus on grand narratives of politics and war. The subtle personal dynamics of a cloistered court can seem less important. But the story of these forgotten men shows another kind of power. Influence doesn't always come from a sword or a law. It can flow through a shared poem or a quiet conversation. The affection of a monarch, even a weak one, could shape fortunes in ways official chronicles never captured. The story of Japan's forgotten men is more than a historical curiosity. It forces us to look beyond official records to see the hidden currents of human relationships that truly drive history. It reminds us that the most powerful people aren't always the ones whose names are carved in stone. Sometimes they are the whispers in the halls of power, the emperor's secret shadows, the ones meant to be forgotten. Uncovering hidden histories is what we do. The past is full of forgotten figures and lost stories waiting to be rediscovered. If you want to journey with us into more overlooked corners of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. From the perfumed air of the Heian court to the rigid modernization of the Meiji era, the world of the emperor's male companions was a small mirror of Japan's own evolution. They were born from a culture that saw beauty and connection as a form of power. They thrived in a gilded cage of luxury and peril. And they vanished when Japan refashioned itself in a new Western image, becoming ghosts in their own history. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is always more complex than the official record, and sometimes the most compelling tales belong to those who were never meant to have a voice. Now let's take a look at the secret life of Istanbul's male concubines. The year is 1687, and within the labyrinthine heart of the Topkapı Palace, silence is a currency more valuable than gold. Here in the privy chamber of the Sultan, the air itself seems to hold its breath, thick with the scent of aloes wood, ambergris, and the faint metallic tang of paranoia. Imagine a young man no older than 17, his name and past erased, now known only as Yusuf. His skin is the colour of pale olives. His eyes are dark pools reflecting the flickering candlelight from 100 silver lamps. He stands perfectly still, a human statue carved from fear and ambition. His sole purpose is to exist within the line of sight of the most powerful man in the world, God's shadow on earth, Sultan Mehmed IV. This is not a story of love, but of possession. Not a tale of romance, but of a terrifying gilded servitude where a misplaced glance or a single unwanted wrinkle could mean a swift, silent journey to the Bosphorus in a weighted sack. His life, and the lives of countless boys like him, represent a secret history, a chapter deliberately torn from the grand narrative of empire, a story of the slaves of the Sultan's pleasure. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. To comprehend the gilded cage of the Sultan's favourite, one must first comprehend the vastness of the empire that constructed it, an empire that saw itself not as a nation, but as the ordained order of the world. At its zenith, the Ottoman state was a colossus straddling 3 continents, a mosaic of peoples, faiths and tongues held together by the absolute and unassailable will of a single man, the Padishah, the Sultan. He was more than a king. He was the caliph of all Muslims, the heir to the Roman Caesars, and in the hushed whispers of his court, the terrestrial reflection of divine authority. His power was not merely political or military, it was gravitational, pulling all things toward its centre in Istanbul, the city known as the abode of felicity. Within this city, the Topkapı Palace, the Saray, the sublime, port of daily life, was the nucleus of all power, a sprawling complex of courtyards, kiosks and gardens that was less a residence and more a self-contained universe, a hermetically sealed ecosystem of governance, ritual and intrigue. It was here, behind layers of immense walls and guarded by legions of soldiers, that the Sultan's life unfolded in a state of perpetual public secrecy. Every breath he took, every meal he consumed, every word he uttered was a matter of state, governed by an intricate and suffocating protocol. This was a world where personality was subsumed by position, and the man himself became an icon, a living symbol of the state's permanence and power. At the heart of this symbol was a fundamental principle. The Sultan owned everything and everyone within his domain. His ownership was not merely a matter of law, but of divine right. His viziers, generals, servants and companions were, in the final analysis, extensions of his own being, lives and bodies, subject to his whim. It was in this crucible of absolute possession that the institution of the male concubine was not an anomaly, but a logical, if terrifying, expression of ultimate power. The Sultan's desires were not mere personal appetites. They were the desires of the empire itself, and the empire would provide no matter the human cost. When the Western mind conjures the Ottoman court, it almost invariably drifts to the exotic, forbidden world of the harem. Jewelled odalisques, silken veils, feminine intrigue. This vision, fueled by centuries of Orientalist fantasy, is not entirely false, but it is dangerously incomplete, because it ignores the harem's male counterpart, an institution just as vital, just as opulent, and in many ways far more influential. This was the Enderun, the palace school, a world existing in parallel to the female harem, hidden within the same palace walls, yet governed by its own rules and its own horrors. If the harem was designed to produce heirs and satisfy the Sultan's domestic needs through women, the Enderun was designed to produce the empire's ruling class and satisfy his intellectual, artistic, and intimate needs through exceptionally gifted and beautiful boys. These youths, boys of the interior, were not merely servants. They were raw material from which future grand viziers, governors, and generals would be forged. The school was a marvel of human engineering, a factory for producing a new kind of man, one whose loyalty was not to family, tribe, or homeland, for all of these had been stripped away, but to the person of the Sultan alone. It was both a university of the highest calibre and a hothouse for cultivating personal devotion, a place where the lines between education, servitude, and intimacy blurred into near non-existence. The boys of the Enderun were taught to be poets and warriors, musicians and mathematicians, administrators and enforcers. They were polished like rare gems, minds sharpened, bodies perfected, all for the singular purpose of serving and pleasing the absolute master. This dual nature of the Enderun is the key to understanding the phenomenon of the male favourite. He was at once a potential statesman and a potential lover, a symbol of the empire's future and a vessel for the Sultan's most private desires. The path to power did not run only through battlefield or council chamber. It also ran through quiet, perfumed corridors of the Sultan's private apartments, a path open only to the most beautiful, intelligent, and obedient of these palace boys. The question of where these perfect specimens came from leads us down one of the darkest corridors of Ottoman statecraft, the institution known as the Devshirme. This was the notorious blood tax, a child levy by which the empire harvested its future elite from the Christian peasant populations of its Balkan territories. Periodically, imperial officials swept through villages in Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Albania, inspecting the sons of Christian families. The handsomest, strongest, and most intelligent boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, were taken from their parents by force. It was calculated cruelty, a programmatic severing of roots designed to create administrators and soldiers with no ties to anyone but the Sultan. The trauma is impossible to overstate. It was a kind of death. A boy was torn from his home, his family weeping by the roadside, never to be seen again. Loaded onto a cart, he began a long journey to the imperial capital, a journey during which his name, his language, and his faith were scheduled for demolition. While the Devshirme was a primary feeder system for the Janissaries and broader civil administration, the palace itself had other, more direct avenues for acquiring its human treasures. War provided a constant stream of captives, the sons of defeated nobles and princes. Slave markets in Istanbul, Alexandria, and Algiers teemed with human cargo from across the known world. Fair-skinned Circassians were prized for ethereal beauty, athletic Georgians, sensitive Persians. Provincial governors sent gifts of particularly beautiful youths as tribute, hoping to curry favour with the central court. Whether seized from a Balkan village or purchased like livestock in a sun-drenched market, the first experience was often the same: violent dislocation, total loss of agency, and the terrifying realization that one's body was no longer one's own. It had become a commodity, its value determined by features, grace, and the potential to please a distant, unseen master. This was the raw, weeping human clay the empire would now mould into a perfect gilded servant. Arrival in Istanbul was a shock to the system, a sensory and psychological assault from which a boy might never fully recover. For a youth torn from a rural village in the Balkans or the Caucasus, the imperial capital was another planet. Imagine the skyline pierced by a forest of minarets, the great dome of Hagia Sophia dominating the horizon. The Golden Horn choked with the masts of ships from every corner of the Mediterranean and Black Seas, The air, unlike the clean scent of a mountain home, was a thick soup of smells: brine, roasting chestnuts, grilling fish, the sweetness of rose syrup in the bazaar, and the ever-present undertone of 1,000,000 bodies living in close quarters. The sounds were a cacophony, calls to prayer from 100 mosques overlapping in the air, the clang of smiths' hammers, the babble of 12 languages, the creak of ox carts, the shouts of merchants. The city was designed to awe and intimidate, to communicate the sheer scale of the entity that now owned him. The final destination, Topkapi Palace, was more intimidating still. It was not a single elegant building, but a vast walled city within a city, its gates guarded by stern-faced janissaries who seemed like giants. To pass through those gates was to leave the world behind. The first step in indoctrination was the systematic erasure of the past. The boy's Christian name was replaced with a Muslim one: Murad, Selim, Ibrahim, a name that was not a gift but a brand. He was forcibly converted to Islam, taught the basic tenets and prayers of a faith that, until then, had been the religion of his captors. His native language was forbidden. He was forced to learn Ottoman Turkish, the complex, elegant language of the court. His rough peasant clothes were taken away, burned, and replaced with fine linens and silks of a palace page. This was not merely a change of scenery. It was ritual destruction of identity, a psychological flaying designed to leave the soul naked and receptive to a new singular purpose: service to the Sultan. Once stripped of his past, the young X-Olan, palace boy, was inducted into the Enderun Palace School, a world of almost monastic discipline and relentless education. This was not a place of idleness or simple servitude. It was an elite academy whose curriculum would have rivaled the finest institutions of Europe. The goal was to create a Renaissance man in an Ottoman mould, a polymath as deadly with a sword as he was with a line of poetry. Days were rigidly structured from before dawn until after dusk: prayer, study, and physical training. They learned to read and write in 3 of the most important languages of the Islamic world: Ottoman, Turkish for administration, Persian for poetry and high culture, and Arabic for theology and law. Their minds were steeped in Persian poets like Hafez and Sa'di, whose verses often celebrated youthful male beauty and the intoxicating nature of longing. They studied mathematics, geography, law, and theology. But education was not merely academic, it was intensely artistic. Each boy was expected to master a craft, a humour. Some became brilliant calligraphers, trained to produce holy texts and imperial decrees of breathtaking beauty. Others became master musicians, learning the oud, the ney, or the tanbur, filling the palace with melodies meant to soothe the soul of a weary ruler. Still others trained in miniature painting, leatherwork, clockmaking, or gardening. This education served a dual purpose. On one hand, it equipped them to become administrators of a vast empire. On the other, it made them perfect companions, men who could serve dinner, compose a poem about victory, debate philosophy until dawn, and beautify a ruler's world with art. They were being turned into living works of art. Alongside this intellectual and artistic cultivation was a grueling physical regimen: horsemanship, archery, and the scimitar, ensuring these delicate poets and musicians were also capable defenders of the Sultan's person if required. The interior world of the Enderun was a microcosm of the empire itself, fiercely competitive, rigidly hierarchical, and saturated with surveillance. The school was organised into chambers, odalar, representing a ladder of advancement. A new boy began in the lower chambers, performing menial tasks while beginning his education, under the watchful eyes of white eunuchs who served as wardens and masters. Advancement to higher chambers depended on merit, intellectual progress, artistic skill, physical prowess, and above all, unwavering obedience and loyalty. The competition was savage. Each boy knew his peers were rivals for promotion and favour. Friendships were dangerous. Alliances formed and shattered. A careless word or a failed lesson could stall a boy indefinitely, or lead to severe punishment. The system ran on paranoia. The eunuchs watched constantly, but the boys were also encouraged to inform on one another, sowing mistrust and reinforcing the idea that loyalty should run vertically, never horizontally. It was a pressure cooker designed to break the will and remake it in the image of the state, forging devotion to the only source of salvation, the Sultan's favour. To be chosen from this mass of striving youth was to win the ultimate prize, escaping brutal anonymity and entering the sacred inner sanctum of power, a world of unimaginable luxury and even more unimaginable danger. To understand how a sultan could look upon these boys as objects of desire, one must step outside modern Western frameworks and enter the aesthetic and philosophical world of high Ottoman culture, especially the Persian and Turkish poetic traditions that shaped elite sensibilities. Love between an older man and a beautiful youth was not framed in the same way it would be in Christian Europe. In refined circles, it could be idealized, celebrated as a purer or more sublime form of devotion. Rooted in Sufi mysticism and Persian literature, the beardless youth, the shahid, the witness, could be imagined as a reflection of divine beauty. To gaze upon a flawless face was to glimpse perfection. The longing it inspired could be described as spiritual elevation as much as sensual desire. This was not identity in a modern sense. Men who pursued such relationships were often married and had children. Rather, it occupied a complex space between the platonic and the carnal, the spiritual and the sensual. The ideal of male beauty was specific, a youth on the verge of manhood, with soft skin, a graceful, almost feminine build, and a face like the moon. The first growth of a beard was often portrayed as tragedy, the moment ethereal beauty began to harden into ordinary manhood. This aesthetic was everywhere, in poetry, in miniature paintings, in courtly taste. It created a culture in which admiration of a beautiful boy could be treated not as shame, but as refined sensibility, a pursuit worthy of a sultan or a grand vizier. And yet this cultural romance masked a grim reality: coercion. The language of divine beauty softened the brutal truth of inequality, the exploitation of a slave by his master. While Enderun pages were groomed for power and intimacy within palace walls, a more public version of this dynamic played out in taverns and stages of Istanbul, the Köçek, the dancing boys. Unlike Enderun pages, slaves destined for elite service, Köçeks were typically non-Muslims, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Roma, trained as professional entertainers. From a young age, exceptionally handsome boys were taught hypnotic dances designed to blur boundaries. Long hair styled in curls, feminized costumes, embroidered velvet jackets, baggy trousers, belts clinking with coins. Faces were made up, eyes lined with kohl. The dance itself mixed slow, sinuous movements, rapid spins and percussive finger snaps, performed to driving rhythms of lutes, drums, and zithers. The effect was deliberately androgynous and intensely erotic, an ambiguity crafted to intoxicate. They performed at festivals, weddings, and private feasts of the wealthy, where wine and music thickened the air with desire. Patrons showered dancers with coins, and rivalries over a particularly beautiful performer could erupt into violence. They were celebrated, yet profoundly vulnerable, often at the mercy of powerful demands. While distinct from Enderun pages, the Köçek belonged to the same cultural fabric that eroticized youthful male beauty. They were the public face of a desire that found its most secret expression in the Sultan's private chambers. For an Itolan toiling in competitive anonymity, the ultimate moment of transformation was the instant his existence was acknowledged by the Sultan. This was the gaze, a glance from the Padishah that held the power of creation and destruction. It could happen during a ceremony, a review of pages, or by chance in palace gardens. For the Sultan to ask a boy's name, praise his calligraphy, or linger on his music was a terrifying honour. It was culmination and doom in the same breath. To be noticed was to be exposed to the Sultan's desire, yes, but also to the burning jealousy of every other page and every power player in the palace. Selection for private service in the innermost sanctum, the privy chamber, the Hasoda, was a ritual elevation. The boy was separated from peers, given impossibly fine silks, attended by lesser servants, and moved into luxurious quarters surrounding the Sultan's own rooms. This was the point of no return. He was no longer merely a student or servant. He became companion, confidant, favourite. His formal title might be sword-bearer or keeper of the royal linens, but his true function was proximity, permitted to share private space and see the man behind the imperial mask. The luxury was intoxicating, but the pressure was immense. Every word and gesture was scrutinised, not only by the Sultan, but by viziers, eunuchs, and women of the harem, all of whom might see the new favourite as a threat. Life inside the privy chamber was a descent into profound intimacy and absolute danger. The quiet epicentre of empire, where decisions flowed from whispered conversations. Here, the favoured page lived a paradox of immense privilege and total subjugation. His duties were intimate, dressing the Sultan, reading Persian poetry at night, attending him in the hammam, serving meals in an age where poison was a constant fear. He became a shadow, a witness to rage, melancholy, and unguarded humanity. That proximity created influence, but also terror. He learned secrets he could never speak. He became a living repository of state vulnerability. The physical relationship that often accompanied this intimacy must be understood plainly. It was not a relationship between equals, but between master and slave. A youth whose body was not his own to give or withhold. Genuine affection might form, but it was always haunted by the executioner's cord. The psychological toll was immense. He had to be lover, confidant, servant, and sycophant, navigating the shifting sands of a ruler's temper. He lived in hypervigilance, surviving by anticipating desire and reflecting back the image the Sultan wished to see. The privy chamber was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield of envy. To peers, the favourite was a target. Rumours, orchestrated accidents, whispered slander, these were the weapons aimed at him daily. The threat also came from the female harem, the Valid Sultan, Queen Mother, chief consorts, and mothers of princes who viewed a male favourite as a rival for time, affection, and influence. Even grand viziers and ministers regarded him with fear and contempt. A boy with no official office could undo months of policy through a single intimate whisper. Some tried to bribe him, others plotted his fall. Thus the favourite lived suspended in a web of intrigue, isolated by success, trusting no one. His only protection was the Sultan's notoriously fickle affection. The moment the gaze shifted, the wolves would tear. And yet rewards could be astronomical. For a brief period, a boy born a peasant or slave could become one of the most powerful individuals in the world's greatest empire. Not through official rank, but through access. Ambassadors learned that the quickest path to the Sultan's ear ran through the beloved page, and they lavished him with gifts. Clocks, textiles, rare animals, bribes wrapped in flattery. Grand viziers and pashas humbled themselves before him, seeking support for policies and rivalries. A word from him could secure a governorship or ruin an enemy. He became a conduit of patronage, a gatekeeper behind the bedchamber curtains. But this power was derivative, only the reflection of the Sultan's own. It could be extinguished as quickly as it was granted. That made the favourite's rule frantic. Accumulate wealth, secure allies, build protection before the inevitable winter. This cycle fed corruption and paranoia. The more he enriched himself to survive, the more rivals hated him, and the more certain the fool became. Let us build a composite narrative, a story woven from the fates of many favourites. We can call our page Adil the Just, an ironic name given upon entry. Captured as a boy in Georgia, his violet eyes and quick wit marked him for the Enderun. He excelled. Calligraphy, the poetry of Hafez, unmatched skill with the bow. During a poetry reading, the ageing Sultan Murad IV, a ruler famed for cruelty and a taste for beauty, noticed him. Adil was summoned to the privy chamber. For 5 years he was the sun around which the court revolved. A ruler who would execute a vizier for a minor error was said to weep when Adil recited verse. He showered the boy with estates, chests of Venetian ducats, stables of Arabian horses. He commissioned portraits, rare honour. Adil learned to navigate court currents. He became shadow, confidant, lover. He slept at the foot of the imperial bed, a dagger beneath his pillow. Viziers who once sneered now bowed, pressing petitions and purses of gold into his hands. He secured favours, engineered dismissals, tasted the fantasy of power built on servitude. But in Topkapi nothing was invincible except the turning wheel of fortune. The fall of a favourite often began not with thunder, but with a whisper. The Sultan's health failed. Paranoia grew. A losing war made him sullen, prone to violent rages. Adil's beauty, once comfort, now seemed to mock decline. Enemies' whispers found fertile ground. A rival page produced a letter, a forgery, implicating Adil in conspiracy. The Valide Sultan complained of his arrogance. Seeds of doubt sprouted fast. The Sultan's gaze turned cold. Gifts stopped. Poetry reading ceased. Courtiers avoided Adil's eyes. The web tightened. Then the end came without warning. One night, as Adil prepared for bed, the chief white eunuch entered, flanked by 2 figures, palace executioners, traditionally deaf mutes, so they could neither hear pleas nor repeat last words. No trial, no accusation. His rise had been whim. His destruction would be whim. He was stripped of silks. A silken bowstring, the method used to avoid spilling royal-adjacent blood, was slipped around his neck. His last sight was not the Sultan, but the impassive faces of eunuch and executioners, the machinery of the state. His body, like so many before him, was placed in a weighted sack and dropped into the dark currents of the Bosphorus, his brilliant career erased as if it never existed. The fate of a favoured page was not always so grim, but it was always subject to the Sultan's will and to time. The favourite's greatest enemy was not only rival or vizier, but biology. The aesthetic that prized the beardless youth was unforgiving. The first shadow of beard, the hardening jawline, the coarsening skin, these were not signs of maturity but symptoms of terminal decline. Yet the empire was pragmatic. A talented favourite, once his intimate usefulness expired, could sometimes graduate. In his mid-20s he might be pensioned off with a lucrative post, governor in Egypt or Syria, military command, marriage into elite circles. His past in the privy chamber became an open secret no one mentioned. For others the end was obscurity, a minor provincial post, a pension without influence, a life haunted by memory. And for the unlucky, those who fell spectacularly, the only exit was death. The slow decline of this institution came not from moral awakening, but from political and cultural shifts. The practice peaked in the 15th through 17th centuries, when the Devshirme and Enderun were strongest, and the Sultan's authority most absolute. But from the late 17th century onward, defeats and internal decay weakened the palace system. The Devshirme became less frequent and was abolished, cutting off the primary supply of boys. Power drifted toward bureaucratic families and janissary commanders. As the Sultan's direct household power waned, so did the political weight of favourites. The 18th and 19th centuries also brought Western influence. Diplomats returned from Paris and Vienna. European fashions and moral judgments seeped into elite Istanbul. Reformers of the Tanzimat era, eager to modernize, saw the open secret of male favourites as an embarrassment, ammunition for European accusations of decadence. Topkapi was gradually abandoned for European-style palaces like Dolmabahce. The Enderun was closed, replaced by modern academies modelled on France and Germany. The ecosystem that sustained the role, slave elite, cloistered palace life, court aesthetics, was dismantled piece by piece, not out of compassion, but out of desperation to survive in a changing world. Perhaps the most lasting consequence was near total erasure from official memory. History is written by victors, but also edited by the embarrassed. For later Ottoman reformers, and even more for founders of modern Turkey, the history of male favourites clashed with the identity they wanted: heroic, martial, morally clean. The image of conquerors and lawgivers entangled with boy pages did not fit the sanitised narrative, so it was downplayed, censored or denied. Homoerotic poetry was reinterpreted as purely mystical allegory. The Enderun was remembered only as a brilliant administrative school. The boys, thousands of Yusufs and Adils, were rendered invisible, reduced to footnotes or dismissed as hostile European fantasy. This was a second death, more permanent than the first. The executioner's cord ended a life, the historian's pen erased existence, and that is the final horror, the way power controls not only bodies, but memory itself. We are left with a story of profound paradox, a gilded cage whose bars were gold and whose food tasted like ambrosia, but a cage nonetheless. Boys educated to brilliance, yet treated like property. Minds filled with art and literature while bodies were subjected to exploitation. Slaves who could influence an empire, living works of art whose lives were disposable. This is not just a forgotten corner of Ottoman history. It is a universal drama about power, desire, and vulnerability, about how societies build elegant justifications, the language of sublime love and divine beauty, to mask systems of coercion. As we walk through Topkapi today, now a museum quieted by centuries, it is easy to forget these walls were once a stage for intense human dramas. But if we listen closely, we can almost hear the echoes. The faint sound of an oud from a distant chamber, the whisper of a poem, the rustle of silk, and the silent, desperate prayer of a beautiful boy who has just caught the eye of a sultan, praying for a long life he knows he will almost certainly not be granted.